The splash of water echoed in my ears louder than any sound I could remember. Kira's wheelchair was sinking slowly, its wheels spinning helplessly as it descended into the lake. At first, I thought it was an accident, a freak incident, maybe some small mistake I hadn't seen. Kira had been near the water, playing with a toy boat, her hands gripping the sides of her chair as she always did. But then I saw the ripples, the way the chair seemed to fall with purpose, not by chance. I watched helplessly, my heart tightening in my chest. This couldn't be happening. I ran toward the lake, my mind racing. Was Kira hurt? Was she thrown from the chair? Was she still trapped in it? But the chaos of the moment didn't answer the question. It wasn't until later, when I checked the drone footage, that the truth hit me with the force of a punch. There in full view, Karen, the HOA president, was standing by the dock. She had thrown Kira's chair into the lake herself, laughing as it splashed into the water. It was deliberate, cold, cruel. I had always known Karen was a problem, but this was something far worse. I had been wrong to think this was just a petty incident. Karen had crossed a line, and now the truth was caught on camera. Our world had always been quiet. Suburbia. The kind of place where the most chaotic thing that happens is a misplaced lawn ornament or a neighbor's dog getting out. I'd spent most of my life in the corporate world, dealing with high-stakes meetings, contracts, and endless negotiations. But when Emily passed, I knew something had to change. My daughter Kira needed me more than ever, and after her mother's death, I chose a simpler life. We moved to the suburbs, hoping the peace would heal us, and in many ways it did. The house was modest, comfortable, nothing extravagant, but it was ours. And the best part of the day was the time Kira and I spent by the lake. It had become our ritual. Every morning, I'd push her wheelchair down the quiet streets, past the neatly trimmed lawns and toward the water. She'd watch the birds, her little fingers tracing the edges of her toy boat as it bobbed in the water. To the world, she was just another child in a wheelchair, but to me, she was the world. I thought I had everything figured out. Life had become a delicate balance between work and this new routine. Kira was happy. I was happy. Peaceful. Safe. But that peace was never going to last. In every neighborhood, there are people like Karen, those who hide behind rules and facades pretending to be the perfect neighbor. I had always felt her judgment, but I hadn't imagined it would go this far. It started on an ordinary Sunday. The kind where the air feels thick with the scent of grass and the sound of distant lawn mowers humming through the neighborhood. Kira had just finished playing by the water, her tiny fingers still gripping her toy boat, watching it float gently in the lake. The light was golden, spilling over everything in that quiet, almost cinematic way. Peaceful. Perfect. For a moment, it felt like nothing could ruin this. Then, Karen appeared. She was striding toward us, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement, her usual air of superiority hanging over her like a storm cloud. I could already sense the tension building in my chest. She never had a pleasant word to say when she came by. She always had some comment about how things could be better in the neighborhood, about how we could fit in more, though I had no idea what she meant. We had always kept to ourselves, never asking for anything more than a quiet life. But today, she had something else on her mind. "Your daughter's wheelchair is an eyesore," Karen said, her voice cutting through the stillness. I looked at her, blinking, unsure if she was joking. "What? That chair? It's ruining the aesthetic of the community," she continued, gesturing toward Kira, who was now looking up at us, confused. Her small face didn't yet understand the weight of Karen's words, but I could feel it, the subtle sting of her judgment. I felt a rush of anger rise in my chest, but I pushed it down. "This is Kira's wheelchair. It's not just an object. It's a part of her life," I said, my voice low, controlled. Karen scoffed, her gaze dismissive. "If you can't maintain a certain standard here, maybe you should consider moving." My heart clenched. I could feel the insult like a sharp needle piercing through my calm, but I didn't let her see it. Instead, I turned to Kira, who was still watching us, her innocent eyes not yet grasping the full impact of what was happening. I had always prided myself on keeping a level head, but as I looked at Karen, her cruel words still hanging in the air, I knew something was about to change. This wasn't just about her. It was about standing up for my daughter. For Kira. I took a deep breath. "We'll see about that," I muttered, more to myself than to her. I turned and wheeled Kira away. But the seed had been planted. This time, it wasn't just a petty disagreement. Karen had crossed a line, and that would be the last time she ever belittled my daughter. I didn't let Karen see how much her words stung. In fact, I didn't let anyone see it. Not Kira, not the neighbors who had been watching from their windows. I knew how to keep a calm exterior, how to hold everything inside without letting it show. That was my method. The world could keep turning. The chaos could keep raging, but I would always be still, a quiet observer waiting for the right moment to act. But behind that calm facade, something was brewing. The next few days felt like a blur. Kira's laughter echoed in the house, a sound that always seemed to calm me, but my thoughts kept drifting back to that conversation with Karen. Her words had stayed with me like an echo that wouldn't fade. An eyesore. The label stung more than it should have, but I understood why. Karen had made it personal. The wheelchair wasn't just an object to her. It was a symbol of difference. And to someone like Karen, anything that didn't fit into her perfectly manicured vision of the world was an inconvenience, something to be removed or pushed aside. I didn't react immediately. I knew this was bigger than a petty neighborhood argument. I needed to be precise. I needed to watch and wait, so I kept my distance. I went to work, kept up my routines, and made sure Kira had everything she needed. But in the back of my mind, I was building a plan. I wasn't going to confront Karen directly. I wasn't going to shout or lose my temper. I was going to do this with precision, with careful thought. Every action needed to be deliberate. I knew Karen's behavior wasn't isolated. It was part of something larger, something systemic. I checked the security footage from the neighborhood cameras later that night. It was all routine footage. People coming and going, children playing, the usual sights. But then I checked the drone footage I'd been using to monitor Kira's safety around the lake. I had never thought it would capture something like this. And there it was, Karen, standing by the dock, her back to the camera, throwing Kira's wheelchair into the lake. I could see it all, the way she took her time, her smirk as she pushed the chair over the edge. The camera caught the exact moment the wheels splashed into the water. I watched the footage over and over, not believing what I was seeing. It wasn't just a careless act, it was deliberate, and worse, it was cruel. I didn't act right away. Not yet. But I knew that once the plan was set in motion, nothing would stop it. The truth was now in my hands, and the gears of justice had started to turn. Once the footage was in my hands, the weight of what had happened began to sink in. It wasn't just about my daughter anymore. It wasn't just about Karen's cruelty. This was about the system, the HOA, the perfect little community that harbored people like her, who used power to hide their prejudices. I had to expose it all, but how? I kept my movements slow, deliberate, trying to read the room. People were starting to notice the tension, but no one had the courage to speak out. Karen's influence over the neighborhood was deep, cultivated through years of running the HOA with an iron fist. Her position wasn't just about controlling property values or setting community rules, it was about power. Neighbors had always kept their distance, not out of indifference, but out of fear. Fear of Karen. Fear of what would happen if they didn't adhere to her standards. I had seen it in their eyes during HOA meetings. The polite nods, the uncomfortable silences, the way people fell into line whenever Karen spoke. No one wanted to risk their status in the neighborhood, so they kept their heads down and pretended not to notice the darker side of her. But I wasn't like them. I had nothing left to lose. I began reaching out to a few trusted neighbors. Some were hesitant, but I could see the resentment bubbling under the surface. Others were more than willing to speak up, revealing the subtle cruelty they had endured for years. There was a pattern, a quiet history of exclusion, of Karen making life difficult for anyone she deemed unworthy of her perfect community. Kira and I had been just the latest targets in her warped sense of control. Still, I knew this wasn't enough. I needed more than just whispers in the dark. I needed to bring Karen's actions into the light, to show everyone exactly who she was. But doing so would take more than just collecting stories. It would take strategy, precision. I knew I couldn't do it alone. And so, I turned to my network: lawyers, business contacts, former colleagues who owed me favors. Slowly, methodically, I began gathering support. I made sure every word was recorded, every document filed, every interaction logged. I wasn't just going to take Karen down. I was going to dismantle the structure she had built around herself piece by piece. The more I dug, the more I realized how far-reaching Karen's control was. It wasn't just the wheelchair incident. This was a long-standing pattern, and the evidence was right in front of me. I had the power now. It was time to start pushing back, but as the pressure built, Karen's behavior started to shift. I noticed her becoming more erratic, more defensive. She wasn't the same composed woman she had been just days ago. The mask she wore so carefully for years was beginning to crack. The wheels were turning in her mind. She must have known something was coming. She wasn't as untouchable as she thought. And that realization brought a certain satisfaction. I was no longer just a victim. I was in control. And Karen? She had no idea what was coming next. The plan was taking shape, and with every calculated step, I could feel the power shift. I wasn't just a father seeking revenge. I had a weapon, something Karen would never expect: my legal expertise. What Karen had done wasn't just cruel, it was illegal. She had violated not just the unspoken norms of decency, but the very structure of the HOA bylaws. And I knew those bylaws better than she could ever imagine. Before I had moved to this neighborhood, I had worked in corporate law for years, dealing with multi-million-dollar contracts, navigating complex legal landscapes, and managing high-stakes negotiations. I had seen it all. But after Emily's death, I had walked away from that world, seeking peace for Kira. Yet, there was one thing I couldn't escape: my ability to see through systems, to identify the cracks in them, and to exploit those weaknesses. It was the same reason I had insisted on using a drone to monitor the lake, Kira's safety being paramount. It was also the same reason I knew exactly how to handle Karen. I began digging into the HOA's history, its meetings, and its bylaws. I had access to public records, and I had friends who still worked in the industry. It didn't take long for me to uncover the full extent of Karen's power and abuse. She had been manipulating the system for years, leveraging her position to suppress families she deemed undesirable and subtly pushing out anyone who didn't fit her image of the perfect community. The very things she accused others of were the things she had been doing herself all along. I called in a few favors, tapping into old connections from my legal days. I was careful, calculated. I didn't want Karen to sense anything just yet. I didn't want her to know that I was working behind the scenes, gathering everything I could. I made sure the evidence was irrefutable, from signed complaints to testimonies from longtime residents who had felt Karen's pressure but had never been brave enough to speak up. But there was more. Karen's actions weren't just about personal vendettas. The HOA itself, under her leadership, had quietly become a tool for discrimination, favoring certain residents while systematically punishing others. I had all the documentation I needed to prove it. Now, all that was left was to put it all together. The final piece of the puzzle was the footage of the wheelchair being thrown into the lake. That footage would be the key to unlocking everything. It wasn't just a personal attack on Kira, it was the tipping point. Karen had thrown the wheelchair into the lake, but now I was about to throw her world into chaos. I wasn't just fighting for justice. I was preparing to expose the system Karen had built, a system of lies, manipulation, and power. And with the footage in hand, I knew I had the upper hand. I would be the one to expose her for the world to see. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about dismantling the lies she'd hidden behind for so long. And it was time for the truth to come out. The more I thought about how to take Karen down, the more meticulous my plan became. I knew that exposing her cruelty wouldn't be enough if I didn't do it the right way. I couldn't rely on emotion or anger to fuel me. I needed to remain calm, calculated. Precision would be the key. I started by organizing everything. The footage was undeniable, but it wasn't enough on its own. Karen had too many loyalists within the HOA, and a few would likely try to dismiss it as an accident, even though it was crystal clear that she'd thrown Kira's wheelchair into the water. I needed legal backing, testimonies, evidence. The footage had to be presented alongside everything else that had been hidden in plain sight. I enlisted the help of a lawyer I had known from my corporate days, an old friend who specialized in civil litigation. His knowledge of HOA bylaws would be invaluable. Together we began drafting a complaint, not just about Karen's actions, but about the entire HOA's practices. We would file a formal complaint about her abuse of power, including her consistent harassment of families like ours. The goal was to push the HOA into a corner where they had no choice but to respond. The lawyer helped me build a case. We took the time to collect testimonies from the few brave neighbors who were willing to speak out. These were people who had been affected by Karen's control, who had suffered silently for years but never dared to challenge her. I knew this wasn't going to be a quick process. It would take time, patience, and the careful gathering of evidence. But it was necessary, and it had to be done with the utmost professionalism. In the meantime, I gathered all the documentation I could find on the HOA's operations. I wanted to see how deep Karen's control went. I went through meeting minutes, financial statements, and bylaws, digging up everything that had been swept under the rug. There were countless discrepancies: favoritism in who was allowed to build or remodel their homes, exclusionary practices, and even instances of residents being fined unfairly for minor infractions. I made sure everything was documented. Each violation, each missed opportunity for fairness, it was all evidence. But I knew I couldn't just go in guns blazing. The moment I took action, the spotlight would be on me. It wasn't just Karen who I was exposing. It was the entire system that allowed her to thrive. I couldn't afford to make a mistake. Every piece of evidence had to be meticulously organized. Every witness had to be prepared. If I was going to expose the truth, I needed to have everything in place before the storm hit. It wasn't just about Karen anymore. It was about bringing down a system that had been built on lies, manipulation, and power. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became that this wasn't just one bad neighbor. It was a network of abuse hidden behind the veneer of a perfectly kept suburban neighborhood. And so, I continued to prepare. I made sure the drone footage was backed up, the complaints were filed, the testimonies were written. Every day felt like another step closer to exposing the truth. I knew Karen would fight back. She had too much to lose. But I was ready. The truth was on my side. And when the time came, I would be the one who brought it all into the light. The day I had been quietly preparing for had arrived. I knew Karen would try to control the narrative, to deflect, to pretend that everything was just a misunderstanding. But by the time the HOA meeting came around, I was ready, calm, composed, and with all my evidence in hand. The meeting room was packed, the air thick with tension. The usual members of the HOA were there, each one wearing their usual neutral expressions, pretending everything was business as usual. But I could see the slight shift in the atmosphere, the undercurrent of anxiety in the room. People were whispering, exchanging glances, clearly aware that something was off. I stood at the back of the room, watching the board members settle into their seats. Karen was sitting near the front, her usual smug demeanor in place, as if nothing could touch her. She hadn't yet realized that I had all the pieces in place. She still thought she was untouchable. When the time came for me to speak, I rose slowly, my presence quiet but unmistakable. I could feel Karen's gaze on me, sharp, calculating. I walked to the front, keeping my posture straight, my face a calm mask. "Good evening, everyone," I began, my voice steady. "I'd like to bring up a matter that I believe requires your immediate attention." I glanced at Karen, whose eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't say a word. She had no idea what was coming. "I'm sure all of you are aware of the incident involving my daughter's wheelchair in the lake," I continued, watching as a few faces in the room shifted uncomfortably. "I know some of you might have thought it was just an accident, a mistake, but I have evidence to show otherwise." I clicked a button on my phone, and the drone footage of Karen throwing Kira's wheelchair into the lake appeared on the projector screen behind me. The entire room fell silent as they watched the footage, Karen's face frozen in a shocked expression as her own actions played out for everyone to see. "You can see here," I pointed out calmly. Karen deliberately threw my daughter's wheelchair into the lake. And if that wasn't enough, I have additional evidence that shows how she has been using her position to manipulate and bully families in this community. creating a toxic environment under the guise of perfect suburban living. The room was still, the tension palpable. I saw a few heads turn toward Karen, their expressions a mix of disbelief and quiet judgment. For the first time, the perfect image she had so carefully constructed began to crumble. I've gathered testimonies from several residents who have suffered from Karen's actions, her discrimination, and her abuse of power, I added, presenting the printed statements and evidence. And I'm not alone in this. There are many who have felt the weight of her control and are ready to speak out. I could feel Karen's facade cracking. She looked as if she were about to stand up and shout to defend herself, but she remained seated, her face growing pale. The room had turned against her. One of the board members, a longtime resident who had always been on Karen's side, stood up slowly. This is unacceptable, he said, his voice unsteady. We can't allow this kind of behavior in our community. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. Karen's grip on the HOA was slipping, and she knew it. She was no longer the powerful figure she once was. The truth was out, and it was clear that she was losing control. The moment of power was shifting. Karen had always held the upper hand in the HOA, but now I was the one dictating the narrative. I had nothing left to fear because the truth was on my side, and nothing could undo that now. The battle had begun, and Karen had already lost. The following days felt like an unstoppable tide. Once the footage had been shown, there was no turning back for Karen. The truth was now in the hands of everyone in the room, and as the meeting ended, it didn't take long for the whispers to grow louder. The story spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Neighbors who had once remained silent began to come forward, sharing their own experiences with Karen's reign of control and manipulation. It seemed that her cruelty had been more widespread than I had realized. The HOA was reeling. They had no choice but to act. Karen, who had once stood so confidently, her back straight and her words sharp, was now a shell of herself. I watched as she was quietly escorted from the meeting by the board members, her head lowered, the weight of her actions now fully visible. For the first time, Karen looked vulnerable, and it felt like the entire room was watching her unravel. But I wasn't done yet. I wasn't going to let this die down with just the exposure of Karen's actions. I needed to push further to ensure that the system she had built around herself was not only shaken, but dismantled. The HOA was complicit in her behavior, and I had enough evidence to bring them down as well. This wasn't just about Karen. It was about everyone who had been harmed by the corruption hidden behind the perfect lawns and pristine facades. I arranged a press conference where I would lay everything bare. The footage, the testimonies, the documentation, it all had to be seen by the world. This wasn't just an internal neighborhood issue anymore. It was a matter of public accountability. I had already informed the local news, and they were eager to cover the story. The press conference was set in the local community hall. It was a small venue, but the air felt charged with anticipation. As I entered the room, the cameras flashed, the reporters poised with their microphones. The faces of the neighbors who had been silent were now filled with curiosity and support. They were ready for the truth to be heard. "Thank you for being here today," I began, my voice steady and calm, though inside I felt a quiet surge of satisfaction. What I am about to show you is not just about one individual. It's about a system that hides behind its perfect image while inflicting harm on families like mine. The footage of Karen tossing Kira's wheelchair into the lake played again, this time for a much wider audience. The silence in the room was deafening. The shock was evident on everyone's faces. But I wasn't done. I have collected over a dozen testimonies from residents who have lived under Karen's rule, each one revealing a pattern of abuse, favoritism, and exclusion. This neighborhood, which prides itself on its community values, has been operating under the false premise of perfection while secretly allowing this kind of behavior to thrive. I went on to explain the extensive research I had done, the violations I had uncovered, and the way Karen had manipulated the HOA to silence anyone who challenged her. By the end of the conference, the room was buzzing with disbelief, and the media was already drafting their stories. It was clear that Karen's reputation had been irrevocably shattered, But the most powerful moment came when one of Karen's own allies from the HOA stood up, clearly shaken, and said, "We cannot continue to ignore this. We have been complicit." That was the moment I knew the battle was over. Karen's empire was falling apart, and with it the carefully constructed world of the HOA. The public exposure was the final blow. Karen had no way out. The truth had caught up with her, and there was no hiding it anymore. Karen was removed from her position as HOA president, but that was just the beginning of her downfall. The media frenzy continued, and it wasn't long before a full investigation was launched into the HOA's practices. They dug into everything: her financial dealings, her manipulation of the rules, the ways she had bullied families who didn't fit her narrow vision of the neighborhood. It turned out the perfect facade was just that, a facade, and behind it, the rot had been festering for years. Karen was not only removed from the HOA, but faced legal consequences for her actions. The case against her grew as more residents came forward, and her position became indefensible. But it wasn't just about her punishment, it was about the change that followed. The HOA, now under new leadership, implemented reforms to ensure that such abuse could never happen again. The new board worked to rebuild trust, to open the doors to all families, and to create a truly inclusive community. For me, though, the true victory came on a quiet evening. A few weeks later, when I took Kira down to the lake again, the sun was setting, casting a warm glow across the water. She smiled, her eyes sparkling as she watched the birds fly overhead, the soft breeze playing with her hair. The wheelchair was no longer a symbol of exclusion. It was just a tool for her to enjoy the world. As I watched her, I realized that justice wasn't just about the legal battles or the public exposure. It was about restoring peace to our lives. It was about showing Kira that she was worthy of respect, of love, and of a community that would never treat her as less than anyone else. And for Karen, it was about the quiet, undeniable fact that she had crossed the wrong person, and the truth had come back to claim what was hers. Standing by the water, watching Kira smile as she played, I couldn't help but reflect on the journey. It had been a battle, yes, but one that had to be fought for the right reasons, for the right people, for my daughter. The world doesn't always play fair. People like Karen are everywhere, hiding behind their masks, using power to control and belittle those they deem inferior. But I learned something through all of this, that true strength isn't in shouting the loudest or striking hardest. It's in being patient, calculated, and knowing that when the time comes, you act with unwavering clarity. Justice wasn't about vengeance. It was about making sure my daughter could live in a world where people like Karen couldn't thrive. It was about standing tall, not just for my family, but for everyone who had suffered in silence. As I took Kira's hand and walked back toward our house, I felt at peace. Not because the fight was over, but because we had won, and the world was a little bit better for it. What would you have done if someone hurt your child's peace? Tell me below. Subscribe for more true justice stories.